Hello, good morning. Today is our guest, Dr. Wanjiru Njoya. Hello, Wanjiru. How are you doing?
Hi, Lipton. Fine, thanks. How are you?
I'm great, and I can see it on your face. You're quite elated to be here.
I am, yes. Thanks for
Yes.
having me on.
So, Wanjiru, you're one of the leading dissident academics today on the right. And before starting the interview, I was telling you that I was doing some research and I discovered you and your blog, and then I didn't remember your name. But luckily for the Journal of Libertarian Studies, I read your paper, so now we know Wanjiru Njoya. So today we're going to be talking about your paper published by the Journal of Libertarian Studies titled A Critique of Equality Legislation in Liberal Market Democracies. Wanjiru, what is equality legislation?
So I was referring that to legislation that says that its aim is to promote equality. So that's the key feature of it. It expresses its aims and its goals, which everybody would agree with. We want to promote equality. We want everyone to be included. We want fairness. We want to reverse historic disadvantage, all these types of goals. And then when you look at the implementation, it says things like, it lists groups of people who are to be protected or defended or promoted. So on grounds of race, sex, gender, sexual orientation. So there's a whole list of characteristics that we call protected characteristics or forbidden grounds, because you can't discriminate based on those grounds. And then also, perhaps more controversially, it says that you should take measures actively to promote these groups. And then there are legal claims that members of these groups can bring to get compensation if they feel they've been discriminated against, and financial penalties for employers. Mostly, many of the cases involve employment, but any public body that is guilty of discrimination. So you might say, what does public body mean? The boundaries are not very clear, but it's essentially anybody that has a public facing role, let's say, or is in receipt of public funds. So the reason I stated it as equality legislation is because I wanted to include not just the UK, where I take my examples from, but also the US, Canada, and other similar jurisdictions.
Brilliant response. Professor, we're now going to talk about disparate impact, and I have an interesting case to share. What's disparate impact?
It's defined in different ways in the legislation, but it basically means that you have a principle or a policy that looks neutral on its face. So for example, a test. So it looks neutral on its face because everyone has to do the test. Everyone has to do the same test. There aren't different tests for different groups. Okay, so that's fine. It looks neutral, but it has a disparate impact on different groups. So you're saying something like, we consistently see particular groups performing more poorly on this test. That's the disparate impact. So essentially this law is saying something like, we don't just check whether things appear on the face of it to be equal, but we also have to look at the impact that it has on different groups. And if we find a disparate impact, what some people just call gaps. You know, there's a gap there's a performance gap, there's an attainment gap, then that in itself could potentially amount to discrimination.
Now I'm going to be sharing this funny case. So Soma Capital is a venture capital company, instructed prospective employees to do an IQ test, and the company was heavily criticized for doing so on the basis that IQ tests have a disparate impact on minorities and women. But what people really say is that IQ studies in the literature have been proven to be highly replicable. So they're valid and you can take them seriously. And IQ is robustly correlated with cognitive performance, job performance, well-being, etc. So I don't have a problem with IQ tests. Preferably, I would rather show my degree than to do an IQ test, because some IQ tests can be tricky, and as human beings, we prefer the easier route usually. But I really don't have a problem with an employer saying, if you want this job, do an IQ test. It's tantamount to saying, if you're going to be employed at Google, you need to have a master's in engineering for the particular post. So IQ tests are quite valid, and Blacks on average actually do better on the verbally loaded components of the IQ test, and these components are more culturally specific. Therefore, if we're arguing that IQ tests are biased, then the cultural components of such tests should not favor Blacks, and they do.
Yeah, so when I agree, when people say that the test is biased, that's very interesting, because it's not the test itself that's biased. I mean, there have been cases about this. The case, I think I discussed it in the paper that you read.
ESOP? And
Yes,
yes, tell us about ESOP.
in that case, the test itself was not alleged to be biased, because they had got an independent evaluation of the test itself to see if the test was biased. And I think there have been lots of tests. I mean, Thomas Sowell has written about this, that it's not the test itself that's alleged to be biased. So what people are saying is it's more about the disparate impact. They're saying, well, the test is fine, but if we look at the results, the outcomes, we see a disparate impact. We see certain groups doing disproportionately less well on the tests. That's the claim they're making. Comparing for no other variables. So they're not looking at, as you mentioned, qualifications. They're not looking at experience. They're not looking at time invested in the job. They're not looking at anything else except the outcome of the test. So say, for example, you've been working very hard and you've prepared very well for the test, and you do better on the test, and somebody else who hasn't bothered to prepare does less well on the test, then you can't really compare the two outcomes and say the test has a disparate impact. For sure, there's some kind of attainment gap. Yes, nobody can dispute that. But what we don't know is the cause of the gap. And we know that there are multiple potential causes of that gap, which nobody is prepared to look at. They say, well, there was a test, and therefore the test has disparate impact, and therefore the test should be abolished. I just want to clarify that to prove disparate impact, and this is the point I was making in the paper, you don't have to show that the test itself is biased. You only have to show that the impact of the test is disproportionate. You don't have to show what other variables might also have caused that impact to be disparate.
And another problem with disparate impact is that it's a bit subjective. So today in the UK, according to the latest report, racial gaps in income are receding for young people. So Tony Sewell published a report and was vilified by the British media for debunking popular lame motifs. So as I said earlier, racial gaps in income in terms of the younger population are declining. We also know that the gender gap is declining, and in the white community, there are multiple variations in income. So German Americans make X amount of money. Americans of Australian descent are actually earning way above the median income. So why should we even care about disparate impact or gaps? People are different. You're an attorney. I have a podcast. You may like physics. I may like chemistry. And our preferences will impact outcomes and will impact outcomes and income. So for example, some studies show that extroverts on average earn more than introverts. So why is this important? Why should we care about gaps any at all?
Exactly, it's a bit ridiculous. It's not even factors like extroverts and introverts. It's other random factors like height. I mean, some people have measured whether you're likely to earn more if you're taller.
Yes.
whether you're likely to earn more. So for women, there was a study, notorious report the other day about a firm, an accounting firm that requires women to wear high heels because they think that, you know, I don't know, it gives them a power look or something, and they just do better and they earn more money from clients. There are just so many different variables. And people are now saying, okay, we need to add more factors to the equality legislation to protect people against discrimination on grounds of how they look. Okay, it's called Lookism. So why should the beautiful people earn more than the ones, you know, it's all ridiculous. So now you're asking why are we interested in this? I think what we can say from the reception of the Sewell report, which you mentioned, that was completely dismissed by people that are interested in gaps, and previous studies, Thomas Sewell, Walter Williams, many people have done studies on this. So why are these studies dismissed? I think ultimately, people who are interested in equalizing income or equalizing wealth, they use these gaps as the justification for why we need legislation to equalize wealth. But those gaps are just the mechanism they use. The ultimate goal is one of equalization, and I don't think we should focus too much on the precise mechanisms that they use to say we need to equalize, because as you have said, you can easily debunk the mechanisms that they rely on, in which case they just move on to other mechanisms. So ultimately, and this is what I've had to highlight in other work that I've written, it's about a debate on whether everybody should be equal, regardless of what's causing the inequality. Should we say, well, everybody should be equal, so let's do whatever we can to make sure that everyone is equal, regardless of the causes of the inequality? And I think that's what we're seeing now with this notion of equity. They're saying equity means everyone should be equal. Okay, so forget worrying about what made them unequal. Let's just make sure everyone's equal. And that's what I think is the fundamental issue here.
But Wanjiru, in some cases, preferring beautiful people actually makes perfect sense. So if you're running a bank, you want the tellers to be attractive. There's a reason why CEOs and politicians tend to be attractive. On average, attractive people make more and they're easier to look at. So for some jobs, but I'm being
Yeah.
realistic. So you're
Yes.
easy to look at. People like beautiful people where facial structure is palatable. And secondly, in other cases, unattractive people may be suitable. So if you are running a security company, you want men who look aggressive and menacing. Women who work in the security industry are not usually slim. They tend to be a bit obese and they look aggressive. You want scary people.
Oh,
So
yeah.
looks are important. Never underestimate the importance of looks. They're important.
So
Let me give another example. So I
yeah.
read the BBC Future once, and BBC Future made reference to a study saying that if you're too attractive, it can be a disadvantage because
Yeah.
for some jobs, it's better to have an individual who's scary, not an attractive person. If you're too attractive, it may put you at a disadvantage to secure employment in some sectors. So looks are important.
Yes. And what I think is clear from human interactions is that if somebody, an employer or somebody running a business, knows their business best, okay, so if we say, well, no, we need legislation to tell them what sorts of people they need to be hiring. So just to give an example, in the police force or the army, or the fire brigades, so people say, why should you have height requirements? What difference does a person's height make? You know, all heights are equal, and you should just hire people even if they're not the height that you think. Okay, so why should we tell people who are actually in the business whether height is relevant or not. Surely they're the people best placed to decide whether height is relevant to their affairs or not. So if they wrongly think that height is relevant, let's say, for example, and somebody comes along and proves in the ordinary course of human affairs that actually height isn't relevant, they would soon correct, because people are rational for the most part. They want to be successful in what they're doing. So what I have a difficulty with is not debates about should height matter, should looks matter. It's about the prerogative of each person to make their own decisions and to decide what matters to them. And if they get it wrong, they'll just fail. So to take your example of an accounting firm that decides, oh, we're just going to hire people who look pretty, that's all. We don't care if they can actually add and subtract. We just care whether they look attractive. They'll soon fail, and they'll soon realize, actually, we need people that can actually do the work. So we don't need legislation, that's my point, to tell people whom they should prefer, what factors they should take into account, because the market soon sorts them out, doesn't it?
Yes, and the market is more efficient at sorting out these problems than the government. So I recently wrote a piece on enslaved overseers during slavery. Now, despite being black, in many instances, these men were preferred to whites on the basis that they were more competitive and competent. So even during slavery, the apex of racism, racist employers preferred blacks relative to incompetent whites. People would rather to earn than to lose. So even
Yes,
if you're racist, you want to make money.
exactly. If you're running a farm, okay, you could say, I don't care if the workers can actually do any farming because I'm a racist. All I want is the correct race of people, even if they're completely useless. I mean, your farm isn't going to run from season to season on that basis, is it? In the end, you're going to have to hire people that can do the work, whether you want to or not, because you're compelled to by circumstances. So some people have a taste for racism and they're prepared to go bankrupt in order to satisfy that taste. And, you know, that's a matter for them. And some people can, let's say, skate along from one season to the next. But eventually, first of all, the proportion of people that can survive by satisfying their taste for racism are not a significant proportion. And even they eventually will come to an unhappy end. So it's like we were saying earlier, there are so many studies showing this that we cannot say people don't know this. And in any case, it's common sense. If you just look around you, common sense will tell you that this is the way of the world. So we come back to the real problem, which is that people are really saying, well, we don't care about any of that. We just want people to have equal amounts of stuff. We want people to be equal. And so we don't care about the evidence and the data, and we're just going to equalize. That's what it is at the end of the day.
According to Bates, redistribution is motivated by envy. There are two issues going on. One, envy, and secondly, utopian thinkers want to turn earth into heaven. Humans are imperfect. We're not angels, and even angels fail. Look at Satan. Lucifer was a respected angel, but he still failed. People are not perfect. Earth can never be heaven. And if you live on earth, you're going to encounter problems and you will meet people who are not as competent as others. But luckily for us, there's a market. Perfect example, YouTube. Entertainers on YouTube, people who talk about beauty, they make a lot of money. Many of the illustrious YouTubers like Jeffree Star, they're talking about entertainment. Why? Sorry, not entertainment. These are beauty YouTubers, but many of these people, they focus on entertainment and beauty because human beings like aesthetics. So in the
Yes.
market, there is a place for individuals who are not intellectually inclined. I'm not saying that beauty YouTubers are not smart, but serious people are not going to go on YouTube to watch a makeup video. Let's be realistic. Most
Yes,
people don't. So there is a market for people who are not intellectually inclined, and this is one reason why some intellectuals don't like the market because
yes.
according to their perspective, intellectuals work so hard, but people like Joe Rogan are richer. So what is the market? If you want to do well, provide a palatable product that people can digest. Yes, so it's really a combination of envy and utopianism.
Absolutely. And I think that this is what you've explained is the reason why egalitarians who want everyone to be equal, because that's their philosophy, they feel that everyone should be equal. This is why they denigrate the market, because it's a counter argument to their scheme. Essentially, an egalitarian scheme says we must have equalization policies because without them, some people will never find opportunities. They're doomed. So they don't like the facts that you just described, the fact that actually the market has a niche for everyone. It counters their philosophy.
That's why I recently argued that although IQ and genes are important because the market is so dynamic, even if you don't score highly on IQ tests, you can still outperform your peers in the market. And I've seen this occurring time and time again. We don't know what will be the next big innovation 2 years from now, 10 years from now, or even 10 months. So luckily for intellectuals, they should actually like the market because it's equalizing. It has an equalizing effect. Even if you are not really smart or really rich, because of the market, you can still do well.
It does have an equalizing effect. I think what they say is that the equalizing effect doesn't operate as quickly as they would like. I think that's the problem. So if you have, for example, wealth accumulated over generations, I think they say, well, that's not quick enough. If we have legislation, we can do it now. You know, we can just do a direct transfer. That explains, for example, if we take it to the international level between rich countries and poor countries, if you look at the timeline of how rich countries have grown, I think people are saying, well, we don't want poor countries to have to go through that, even though you can accumulate wealth faster now than you could before.
Exactly my
So many
point.
reasons, but yeah.
Look, many countries are still poor due to deficient institutions, corrupt governance, and low levels of human capital. This is not 1600, it's the 21st century, so benchmarking is easier. Europeans got a head start because they were adept at benchmarking, and today it's even easier to benchmark because you can go on Google and say, okay, let me look at the SME policies in South Korea or Singapore. You can connect with ambassadors from other countries, so it's easier to get rich today because the learning curve is simple. It's not like when we were in 1800. We didn't have the internet. You couldn't just buy a book and get it shipped to your house in a few weeks, or go online to look at the economic policies in Germany and see if they can be applied in New Zealand. We can do all of this today. So there is actually no excuse for poverty.
We can, and we don't have to reinvent the wheel. We've got the internet, books are affordable, courses are free on YouTube. You can learn anything you want. You don't even have to buy books or pay a teacher to teach it to you. You know, the teachers are all there on YouTube for free. If you can't afford the internet, some people say, oh, well, you know, it's what I think they're calling it digital inequality. Some people have no access to the internet. You can go to a public library. In fact, anyway, it's so easy to get access to free stuff on the internet if you're trying to learn. So here's the problem though, is that while the poor countries are getting richer, the rich countries are also getting richer. So people who are worried about the gap are always going to have a gap. You know, so that's people fixated on gaps are never going to be happy, because no matter how much the poor get richer, the rich are also getting richer. So what they're trying to say is something like, some people, we should not have a world where some countries are richer than other countries. All the countries have to be equal. It's a philosophy of everybody being equal, and that's the problem. They're not saying no one's getting richer. They're saying the rich are getting richer. So if you take an example of space travel, okay, so poor countries are getting richer. Now they have food and they have education. But look at what's happening in the rich countries. They're going to Mars. That's the problem that the gap people have got. They don't like the gap.
That's not a problem. I live in a country that's upper middle income, but poverty is a problem. Poverty has been reduced quite substantially over because people are relatively poor. They still complain about the cost of living. So I live in Jamaica, and the cost of living in Jamaica is actually inexpensive. Kingston is one of the cheaper cities in the world, but people are poor, so they're going to complain about the cost of living. And many people in poor countries don't want to go to Mars. So what's the problem? Even people in rich countries believe that going to Mars is just weird and outrageous. It's just an example of billionaires and their decadence. Do you want to go to Mars?
I should love to go to Mars, but here's the problem that we've got. Even in rich countries, there are poor people. So, we have to distinguish between poverty and inequality. If we're talking just about poverty, then yes, even in rich countries, there are poor people who don't have enough to eat. They're worried about putting food on the table. The fact they live in a rich country doesn't mean that they're not poor. So speaking about poverty, yes, I think that poverty alleviation is a very important goal. But the types of issues that we're talking about today to do with equality legislation, that legislation is not aimed at addressing poverty. It doesn't say, let's identify the poor people and let's identify ways to help them. It's not poor relief legislation, it's equality legislation. It's focused on gaps. They're not saying, well, let's focus on the people who can't put food on the table. They're saying, let's measure the gap between the richest person, the CEO of a firm, and the lowest waged person in that firm. So let's add up all wages in the firm and average that, and also calculate what multiple the CEO earns more than the poorest person in the firm. So the CEO earns 100 times more than the cleaner. Oh no, there's a gap, we have to fix that. So I think we should distinguish between poverty and inequality and emphasize that all these schemes have nothing to do with poverty alleviation. They have to do with closing the wealth gap. So to go back to the Mars example, they're not saying something like, if we ban billionaires from going to Mars, everyone will be able to put food on the table. In essence, they're saying something like, we don't like the gap that allows some people to be rich and to decide what to do with their money, where other people haven't got the same amount of money. It's about an equivalence of money rather than so much what people are doing with their money.
Poverty, I rather to focus on reducing poverty than income inequality. And income inequality does not prevent poverty reduction. Jamaica has high levels of income inequality, but the poverty rate declined. Even in the United States, the middle class is getting smaller because people are getting richer. So if these people are not quite serious. Another perfect example. They like to criticize IQ and the performance of superior people, but they want the best teachers to teach their children. There isn't a lobby group saying that physics teachers shouldn't have a degree in physics or some other science. They want competent teachers to teach their children, suggesting that IQ and other variables of performance are important.
Oh my, you picked a very interesting example there with physics and sciences, because actually people are saying that we shouldn't focus on sciences. That there was a paper that got an award in physics that was about Black women in physics. That's what it was about. Okay, so the paper says something, I can't remember the exact title, but it's something like, why aren't there enough Black women doing physics? Here's how I feel. I'm a Black woman and I do physics, and here's how I feel, you know, every time I walk into the lab and there are no other Black women, just me. And, you know, every time I read papers, they're written by white men. That's physics, allegedly.
Yeah. So I know that, sorry to cut you, but I know that at some schools, there is a thrust to create inclusive physics and to talk about emancipatory science and mathematics.
Yes,
But it hasn't trickled
yes.
down to the base level yet, where ordinary people are saying, why should a physics teacher teach my children? It hasn't trickled down to that level yet, but it might get there. It's getting there.
I think that's exactly what the decolonization move is doing. It's absolutely getting there. It's in schools now. It is, because when that's what they say, when they say we want to decolonize the curriculum, I mean, you've seen yourself decolonize mathematics. They're saying something like, well, you know, 2 + 2, who said it's 4? It could be
Yeah,
anything. It might
yes,
count
do,
2
yes.
+ 2. So it is absolutely in schools now. It isn't something that you can say that the schools are not doing this. They absolutely are.
Yes, I didn't remember that. 2 + 2 doesn't need to equal 4.
It
And
can be anything you want.
and many schools are actually scrapping admissions exams, so like the ACT, the SAT, etc. So we're definitely getting there, and it's quite unfortunate, especially for the people identitarians are claiming to help, because they're never going to get quality jobs. And unfortunately, minorities who are going to be employed by the new elite managerial state are rich minorities. So upper middle class minorities who do well in school, they're going to get the jobs, not working class minorities.
I wish that were true. I fear that what employers are doing exactly the same, and they're saying we'll hire people to fill the quota. So you may say, well, they won't get any jobs if they think 2 + 2 is 5, but I fear they will. That's
It's,
exactly that. That's
even
exactly.
working class people.
Oh, you're saying that it won't benefit the working class? Absolutely. Yeah.
No, at least the elites,
Yeah.
some of these people are already smart. They're going to get these jobs, not
Yes.
working class people. The working class people, if they digest such nonsense, are going to be disadvantaged.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. It's people who know how to work the system who enjoy the advantage of it.
Yes. So I am not looking forward to a dystopian future, but luckily for us again, today there's a market for people who criticize identity politics, and we have seen the rise of individuals like Jordan Peterson. This is one reason why he's so successful. He's responding to the market. So even dystopia creates markets and opportunities.
I agree. People are starting to question this scheme that has dominated for so long, and to say we want to do something different. We're seeing new institutions coming up, new colleges, new universities. Absolutely.
Yes. So, Professor, as I said, as I keep telling my guests, I'm doing shorter shows. So, although we're both enjoying this conversation, I have to wrap up. But speaking to you has been a pleasure. And write an article for Mises. You wrote a journal article, write an article for the commentary section.
Oh yeah, that would be great.
Yes, you
Yeah,
should.
and thanks so much for reading my paper. I've really enjoyed talking with you about it.
Yes. All right. Bye. And we'll talk
Thank you.
again.
Bye. Thanks. Bye.